The American rock band REO Speedwagon released an album in the late 1970s called You Can Tuna Piano, but You Can't Tuna Fish. I don't know why, but that's really funny to me. When it comes to making great music that is compelling and engaging, one of the most important and foundational tools is the tuner. If even one band member is playing out of tune, it is a real problem for everyone. So let's get super practical today and talk about this truly foundational aspect of leading worship on today's Weekly Worship Thoughts. If you are leading worship from a keyboard, you probably don't have to worry too much about this all-important part of leading worship. However, if you are leading worship or are even a part of the band with any stringed instrument, including the piano, then you need to be in tune. So here are a couple of tips in no particular order to help you to that end. Invest in a good tuner and use it. Even if you have no other gear on stage with you, you should have a tuner. There are many different kinds available. You can use a clip-on or an inline. There are pros and cons to each type of tuner, of course, but whatever your preference, be sure that you have one and that you are using it. It is a good idea to tune between songs. Many people falsely assume that once their instrument is in tune, it will stay that way for the entire set. This may be true, but I wouldn't count on it, unless of course you are playing a piano. I try to check tuning between every song if the transition allows, and often even in the middle of songs or whenever my instrument is not needed at that moment. A tuner with a mute function is key here. The age of your strings matters. If you are playing the piano, there is not much you can do to change the tuning on a weekly basis. I would still recommend having the piano tuned professionally at a minimum of once per year. For every other stringed instrument, the age of your strings really matters. Guitar strings especially are susceptible to going out of tune with age. I recommend making sure that any guitar strings you use on stage are less than 1 month old. By that I mean that the strings were put on less than 1 month beforehand. For an instrument like the bass guitar or the violin, you can go much longer without changing your strings, but when they stop sounding as crisp as you want them to and when they no longer stay in tune, then it's definitely time for new strings. Change all of the strings. If I'm in the middle of a set and a string breaks, I will try to quickly replace it with just a single string. However, for most other applications, it is always best to change all of the strings. This is because new strings are brighter and old strings are dull. The new string will literally be louder than the old string, and it will give your instrument poor tonal balance if you have old mixed with new. New strings need to be stretched. If you walk on stage with brand new strings that have not yet been stretched, you will be fighting the tuning for the entire set. When I'm finished restringing, I always tune, stretch the strings, retune, stretch the strings again, and retune again. Always retune when putting on or taking off a CAPO. The CAPO is a marvelous tool that allows you to play your preferred chord voicing in a completely different key. I love using a CAPO. However, no CAPO is perfect regardless of what the marketing team says. Every time that I put on a CAPO or take one off, I retune my strings to make sure they are, in fact, still in tune. Intonation matters. If the intonation of an instrument has not been set properly, you will never get the instrument in tune across the board. Many times I have witnessed guitar players strum chords that are nicely in tune with the first 5 frets, but then they jump up to the 12th fret and beyond for a lead part that is heinously out of tune. Even though their fingers are technically on the correct frets, they're not hitting the right notes. Intonation matters. Pressing too hard changes the note. Even if the intonation of an instrument has been properly set, the player's touch matters immensely. If you press too hard on the correct fret, you will no longer be playing the correct note. Let's take a closer look at a few of these tips. First off, the actual tuner that you're using really doesn't matter, just as long as it works well and you like it. Now personally, there are a couple of tuners that I really like. The Boss TU Stomp Box is one of my favorites. This here is a TU3 and it works really well. It has super bright LEDs on it so I can see it really well, and it can mute my signal when engaged, or I can choose to not mute my signal if I'm running a full pedal board and I want to mute somewhere else, possibly at the volume pedal or whatever. It also has a true bypass, so I'm not losing any of the signal by plugging into this box. So I highly recommend this tuner and personally use it myself. This tuner also comes in a few other options, so feel free to look into those if you are interested. Another great option that is really cool is the TC Electronic Polytune. Now personally, I don't like this tuner as much as the Boss, but it still works really well. A cool feature of this tuner is that you can stomp on it to mute your signal and then strum all of your strings, and the display will actually tell you which strings are in tune and which strings are not in tune. So that's a cool feature. I think I prefer this tuner for electric guitar, but not so much for acoustic guitar or bass. Still a great tuner and a little bit cheaper than the Boss. And then there are many different clip-on models as well. I'm a huge fan of this Peterson Strobo Clip tuner, which I use in the studio, but it's a little pricey. Strobe tuning also takes a little getting used to, even though it was the main method for tuning for decades before the modern tuners became available. I still like the strobe, but I'm kind of a weirdo. Strobe tuning is a way more meticulous and precise method, but that's also overkill for being on stage. Now let me demonstrate what happens when you put on a CAPO. Notice that my strings are all in tune without the CAPO. Good. Now let's see what happens whenever I put the CAPO on, let's say the 5th fret. Should still be in tune, right? Not quite. Everything's just a little bit off. And every CAPO is like this, by the way, so don't ever put on a CAPO and think that your strings are still in tune. More than likely, they're not. Let's look at one last aspect of tuning here. I just changed strings on this guitar, but I didn't stretch the strings. So they either need to be stretched by me on purpose, or they will inevitably stretch on their own when I don't want them to. You always want to get the stretch out of your strings manually, and to do that, every string on the guitar needs to be tuned up to pitch, and then you give them a good stretch. Now I like to stretch by putting my fingers on, say like the 7th and the 12th fret a little bit, and just give them a few tugs. So we'll go ahead and do that. I'm pulling them up, pull the bottom strings down a little bit. And now watch what happens. This guitar was just in tune perfectly, and now my E is below a D. So I'll bring it back up. And also one thing to keep in mind is you always want to tune up to pitch. You never want to go down to the pitch. So if I accidentally go too far like I just did, you actually want to go back down underneath and then come back up to pitch. Otherwise, if you lower it down to pitch, you are guaranteed to have that string go flat on you. Good. Now the guitar is in tune again, but watch what happens when I give it another stretch of the strings. Most likely, it will no longer be in tune. It usually takes about 2 times through, and basically the idea is you want to be able to stretch it and not have it go so far down. So, all right, that's not so bad. Again, we'll just tune that right up to pitch. A string's not so bad either. D's not terrible. G's a little flat. B is pretty bad. And E is not so bad. So I may have to just stretch my B string again if I don't want it to go out on me during the set. So there you have it. Just like REO Speedwagon told us half a century ago, you can tune a piano, but you can't tune a fish. Don't get up on stage ready to lead your congregation in worship if you're not prepared with a tuner. What was one interesting truth or idea that stood out to you today, and how do you think that truth or idea will help you in the future? Have you ever been in a situation where either you or someone else in the band is noticeably out of tune? How did that situation make you feel about the music that was being made? Were you able to recover from the situation? If so, how? In your own words, why do you think it is important for every stringed instrument musician to have a tuner with them on stage? If you play a stringed instrument, how often do you change your strings? Did you find the string changing advice presented in this chapter to be helpful? Why or why not? There were a lot of quick tips offered in this chapter. Were there any tips that were unclear or that you are still confused about? If so, what could you do to get more information about those tips?